Chapter 5, Unit 5, Bringing Together Claims and Evidence. 5.1 Understand Synthesis. What synthesis really means. Let's start with an honest confession. The word synthesis sounds intimidating, and a lot of students spend way too much energy being afraid of it when they could be spending that energy actually getting good at it. So let's demystify it right now, sitting here at this metaphorical coffee shop together. Synthesis at its core is the act of combining multiple sources to build something new, a coherent argument that is bigger than any single source could produce on its own. Think of it like a chef making a great soup. No single ingredient is the soup. The carrots aren't the soup. The broth isn't the soup. But when the chef brings those ingredients together with intention and skill, combining them in a way that serves a unified purpose, something new and complete emerges. That's synthesis. You are the chef. The sources are your ingredients. Your argument is the soup. The College Board defines synthesis as the process of combining information from multiple sources to form a new perspective or argument. What's crucial here, and this is where students lose points on the FRQ, is the word new. Synthesis is not summary. Synthesis is not a book report where you describe what each source says one after another. If your essay sounds like source A says this, then source B says this, then source C says something else, you're not synthesizing. You're cataloging. There's a meaningful and scoreable difference. The Synthesis FRQ, what the exam actually asks on the AP Lang exam. The synthesis question is the first of the 3 free response questions, and it gives you 6 to 7 sources on a single topic. Things like urban planning, the ethics of social media, or the value of public art. These sources might include written arguments, data tables, photographs, cartoons, or graphs. Your job is to read them quickly, identify relevant perspectives and evidence, and then write an essay that takes a defensible position and supports it using evidence from at least 3 of the provided sources. That phrase, at least 3 sources, is important to lock in as an exam rule. Using fewer than 3 sources means you cannot achieve a score above a 2 on the evidence and commentary row of the rubric, even if your thesis is brilliant. The College Board is very clear about this threshold. 3 is your floor, not your ceiling, and stronger essays typically weave in 4 or 5 sources purposefully. Defensible thesis, the foundation of everything. Before you can synthesize, you need something to synthesize toward. That means your thesis has to take a clear, arguable position. The College Board calls this a defensible claim, a statement that a reasonable person could agree or disagree with. Saying social media has both benefits and drawbacks is not a defensible thesis, it's a truism, and truisms earn 0 points on the thesis row. Saying while social media platforms provide unprecedented access to civic participation, their algorithmic design actively undermines the informed deliberation that democracy requires. Now that's a claim someone could push back on. That's defensible. That's arguable. Build toward that. A common trap on the FRQ is writing a thesis that merely acknowledges complexity without taking a side. Students often do this because they're trying to be fair to all the sources, which is a good instinct misapplied. You can be nuanced and still be directional. The best theses sound like, although X is true, Y is ultimately more significant because Z, that concessive structure, acknowledges opposing evidence while still staking out a position. Practice that construction until it feels automatic. How to actually use sources. Here's where synthesis gets technical, and technical precision is what separates a 3 from a 5. When you bring a source into your essay, you need to do 3 things: introduce it, use it, and connect it to your argument. The College Board's rubric calls the weakest form of source you merely quoting or paraphrasing. That's when a student drops in evidence without explaining what it means or why it matters. The stronger move is what graders call commentary, where you explain the significance of the evidence and explicitly tie it back to your thesis. But synthesis takes this one step further. Real synthesis happens when you put sources in conversation with each other, when you use source D to complicate or extend what source B established, or when you acknowledge that sources A and C seem to contradict each other before explaining why that tension actually supports your claim. Think of it like a dinner party where you're not just introducing guests one at a time, but facilitating a conversation between them. You'd find Source B interesting because it challenges what Source A assumes about human motivation. That's the move. That's synthesis. Rhetorical choices and evidence types. One nuance the exam tests frequently is your ability to distinguish between types of evidence and explain why a source's form or origin matters. A photograph of a deteriorating public park is doing different rhetorical work than a data table showing municipal budget cuts. Both might support your argument, but a high-scoring essay acknowledges those differences. Describing a photograph means engaging with its visual composition, what it emphasizes, what it excludes, and what emotional or logical work it does. Data and statistics carry the weight of objectivity, but require you to note their source and potential limitations. Personal testimony offers pathos, but invites scrutiny about generalizability. When you identify what kind of evidence a source provides and then argue for why that kind of evidence is particularly relevant to your claim, you're demonstrating the higher-order thinking that earns top rubric scores. Connections to other units. Synthesis doesn't live in isolation. It's the skill that pulls together everything you've been building since Unit 1. Your ability to analyze an author's argument, Unit 3, feeds directly into how you evaluate whether a source supports or complicates your claim. Your understanding of rhetorical appeals, ethos, logos, pathos, helps you explain why certain evidence is more or less persuasive in context. Your work with claims, evidence, and reasoning in Unit 4 gives you the structural vocabulary to build the argument you'll synthesize toward. Think of synthesis as the destination and all prior units as the road that leads you there. A common MCQ trap on synthesis questions is the answer choice that describes a source as proving the writer's claim. Sources rarely prove anything outright. They support, illustrate, contextualize, or complicate. When you see proves or conclusively demonstrates in an answer choice, treat it as a red flag and examine it carefully. The bottom line is this: synthesis is an act of intellectual leadership. You are not a reporter presenting what others have said. You are a thinker deciding what matters, why it matters, and how different pieces of evidence work together to illuminate something true. That's the skill, and with practice it becomes second nature. In the next section, we'll look at how to evaluate and select sources strategically, because knowing how to read a source for what it can do for your argument is the crucial first step before you can bring sources together effectively. 5.2. Understand how to bring together multiple sources. Let's talk about one of the most powerful skills you're going to demonstrate on the AP Language exam, and honestly, one of the most important intellectual habits you'll carry with you long after you've forgotten what day the test was. Synthesizing multiple sources is not just an exam technique. It's the difference between someone who collects information and someone who actually thinks with it. And College Board knows that difference. The synthesis essay, which appears on the AP Lang Free Response section, is specifically designed to test whether you can do the harder, more sophisticated thing. Bring sources into conversation with each other to support an argument you're making. What synthesis actually means. Here's an analogy that tends to stick. Imagine you've invited 5 smart friends over to debate whether your city should build a new stadium. One friend is an economist, one's an urban planner, one's a lifelong sports fan, one's a local business owner, and one's a community organizer who's worried about displacement. Each of them brings something true and valuable to the table. A bad host just lets them talk over each other. A good host, that's you, listens to all 5. Finds the threads that connect them, notices where they agree and where they clash, and then synthesizes their perspectives into a coherent position. That's what College Board means by synthesis. You are the thinker at the center, and the sources are your evidence, not your essay. This distinction is critical for scoring a 5. Many students make the most common and damaging mistake on the Synthesis FRQ. They summarize sources instead of using them. They write something like, Source A says stadiums boost the economy. Source B says stadiums displace residents. Source C says, and on and on. That's a book report. Synthesis means your argument comes first and sources come in to support, complicate, qualify, or extend your claim. College Board's rubric explicitly rewards students who integrate sources to develop a line of reasoning, and it explicitly withholds points from responses that merely compile source content without a controlling argument. The 3 moves of effective synthesis when you're bringing multiple sources together on the exam, think of it as making 3 distinct intellectual moves, and you need all 3 to hit the top of the scoring rubric. The first move is comparison and contrast across sources. You're identifying where sources agree, where they conflict, and this is the sophisticated part, where they seem to agree on the surface but actually emphasize different things. 2 sources might both support renewable energy investment, but one frames it as an economic issue and the other as a moral obligation. Noticing that distinction and using it to develop a more nuanced argument is exactly what earns you the sophistication point on the rubric. The second move is integration without substitution. Your sources should support your argument, not replace it. A common AP exam trap, and a very common reason students lose the development and evidence points, is letting a long paraphrase or block of source material do the argumentative work that you are supposed to be doing. Think of it this way. A source is a weight you're lifting to prove your strength. If you just set the weight on the floor and point at it, nobody's impressed. You have to actually lift it. That means using a source and then immediately telling the reader why it matters to your specific claim. The third move is acknowledging complexity and tension. The AP Lang synthesis prompt almost always provides sources that don't all point in the same direction. That's intentional. College Board wants to see if you can handle nuance. If you use only the sources that agree with you and pretend the others don't exist, you're leaving points on the table. The more sophisticated response acknowledges a counter-argument from one of the sources and then either refutes it, qualifies it, or incorporates it into a more complex version of your own claim. This is where the sophistication point lives, and it's the point that separates a 5 from a 4. How many sources do you need on the AP Lang Synthesis FRQ? You're given 6 to 7 sources. College Board requires you to cite evidence from at least 3 of them to earn a score in the upper range on the evidence and commentary row of the rubric. But here's the important nuance. 3 is the floor, not the ceiling. Students who use 4 or 5 sources strategically weaving them together, rather than treating them as separate items on a checklist, tend to write more compelling essays and earn higher scores. However, attempting to use all 6 or 7 sources sometimes produces a rushed, superficial essay where you mention each source once and move on. Quality of integration matters far more than quantity of sources cited. A common wrong answer trap on the multiple-choice questions tied to synthesis tasks asks you to identify which strategy best demonstrates synthesis. Watch out for answer choices that describe a strategy of presenting each source's main idea in sequence. That's summary, not synthesis. The correct answer will always involve the writer using sources to build toward or complicate a central claim. Attribution and credibility. When you cite sources on the synthesis essay, College Board expects you to attribute them clearly but doesn't require formal citations. You can write according to source C, or, as the chart in source D illustrates, that's sufficient. What earns you points is not the citation format, but what you do after the citation. Stronger responses also engage with source credibility when relevant. If source B is an op-ed by a local politician, and source E is a peer-reviewed study, noting the difference and explaining why you're weighting one more heavily than the other is a genuine act of rhetorical analysis. And it connects directly back to Unit 2's work on evaluating evidence quality and authorial perspective. Connecting to the rest of your AP course. Synthesis doesn't live in a silo. Everything you've studied in this course feeds into it. Your work in Unit 2 on rhetorical situation helps you understand why a source makes a particular argument, audience, purpose, and context. Your work in Unit 3 on claims and evidence helps you evaluate whether a source's reasoning is sound. Your work in Unit 4 on explaining and exploring arguments gives you the vocabulary to describe what a source is doing, not just what it's saying. And your work in Unit 6 on writing arguments will help you understand that the synthesis essay is an argument essay. It just happens to require external evidence. When you sit down to write, you're not doing something new and strange. You're pulling all of those skills together into one coherent performance. The best mental model to carry into exam day is this. You are the author, and the sources are your research. A journalist writing a feature story doesn't just print 6 interviews end to end. She shapes those voices into a narrative that makes her point. That's your job, too. With that foundation in place, you're ready to look more closely at how to evaluate the quality and relevance of each individual source you're working with, which is exactly where we're headed next. 5.3. Understand attribution of sources. What attribution actually means and why it's not just citation. Let's start with a simple question. Why do we give credit to sources at all? You might think the answer is obvious: to avoid plagiarism, to follow the rules, to keep your teacher happy. But think about it the way a rhetorician would. When you attribute a source, you're not just following academic etiquette. You're making an argument about why your reader should believe you. Attribution is a rhetorical move, and the AP exam is going to test whether you understand it that way. Here's an analogy that might help. Imagine you're at that coffee shop and you tell your friend, "I heard somewhere that coffee actually dehydrates you." Your friend shrugs. Now imagine you say, "A cardiologist at Johns Hopkins published a study last month showing that moderate coffee consumption is net neutral for hydration." Suddenly, your friend is leaning in. You said roughly the same thing both times. But the second time, you attributed the claim to a specific credible source, and that attribution did rhetorical work. It didn't just tell your friend where the information came from, it told them why they should care and trust it. That's what the College Board means when they ask you to understand attribution of sources. They're asking you to recognize and analyze how writers use source credit strategically to build credibility, support claims, and position themselves in relation to other voices in a conversation. The mechanics of attribution, signal phrases, and their rhetorical effects. On the AP exam, you'll encounter questions about how writers integrate sources into their arguments, and you need to be precise about the tools they use. The primary mechanism is the signal phrase, the language a writer uses to introduce a source before quoting, paraphrasing, or summarizing it. Signal phrases are not neutral. Every verb in a signal phrase carries a rhetorical charge. Consider the difference between Johnson claims that climate policy has failed versus Johnson demonstrates that climate policy has failed. The word claims introduces a degree of skepticism. It signals that the writer is holding the source at arm's length, perhaps because the claim is contested. The word demonstrates endorses Johnson's reasoning, suggesting the writer finds the evidence compelling. The AP exam will absolutely test whether you can distinguish between signal verbs that indicate endorsement, argues, proves, shows, reveals, demonstrates, confirms, versus those that indicate distance or uncertainty, claims, asserts, suggests, contends, alleges. This distinction frequently appears in multiple-choice questions that ask you to identify a writer's attitude toward a source. The placement of attribution matters too. When attribution comes first, as the economist Paul Krugman argues, the source's identity frames everything that follows. The reader evaluates the quoted material through the lens of Krugman's authority. When attribution comes last, and this has been the dominant trend in modern economies, according to Krugman, the idea lands first and the credentials arrive as backup. Neither is inherently better, but they create different rhetorical effects, and you need to be able to articulate those effects when you see them in a passage. Why attribution builds or undermines ethos. Here's where attribution connects beautifully to Unit 2's work on rhetoric and rhetorical appeals. When a writer attributes sources carefully and credibly, they're building their own ethos, their credibility as a thinker. A writer who cites a range of expert voices acknowledges counterarguments by naming the people who make them, and uses precise signal language, is signaling to the reader, "I have done my homework. I know this conversation. I am a trustworthy guide." The flip side is equally important. A writer who attributes vaguely, some experts say studies show, it has been reported, is actually weakening their ethos even though they're gesturing toward sources. The AP exam loves to test this edge case. Vague attribution is a rhetorical weakness, not a strength, because it denies the reader the ability to evaluate the source's credibility independently. If you see this pattern in a passage and the question asks about the effect of the writer's use of evidence, vague attribution undermines the credibility of the claim, is almost always the correct analytical move. Attribution in your own writing, the FRQ connection. Now let's talk about what this means for your free response questions, because this is where students lose points they shouldn't lose. On the synthesis essay, which you'll encounter in FRQ question 1, you are required to use at least 3 of the provided sources and attribute them clearly. The College Board rubric is explicit. You cannot simply absorb a source's idea into your own prose without signaling where it came from. That's not synthesis, that's ghostwriting for your sources. The most common FRQ mistake is what I call invisible borrowing. A student will absorb a source's specific data point or argument and integrate it so smoothly into their own prose that no attribution remains visible. This looks sophisticated, but it actually costs you points on the evidence and commentary rows of the rubric. The fix is straightforward. Every time you use a source in your synthesis essay, your reader should be able to identify it. You can attribute by source letter, source C argues, by the author's name if provided, or by the document type the infographic from the Department of Education suggests. Any of these work? The key is that attribution must be present and must be doing rhetorical work, not just appearing as a parenthetical afterthought. Distinguishing attribution from citation, a common confusion. Students frequently confuse attribution with formal citation, and this misunderstanding can cost you on the exam. Citation refers to a formal bibliographic system, MLA, APA, Chicago, that documents sources in a standardized way. Attribution is broader. It refers to any rhetorical act of crediting a source within the flow of your argument. The AP exam does not ask you to produce formal citations. It asks you to attribute sources rhetorically, which means your signal phrases, your identification of sources within your prose, and your use of source information to support your claims. You will never lose points on the AP exam for not including a works cited page. You absolutely will lose points for using source material without attributing it within your argument. Connections across units. Attribution of sources doesn't live in isolation. It's the practical application of Unit 2's work on ethos and rhetorical appeals. It feeds directly into the synthesis SC skills of Unit 5, and it connects to Unit 4's argument framework, because how you attribute a source affects whether your reader sees it as support for your claim or merely background noise. When you attribute a source to a credible, relevant expert using an endorsing signal verb, you're simultaneously strengthening your logos, building your ethos, and potentially engaging your readers' emotions by connecting to someone they respect. Attribution is one of those topics where everything in the course converges. With a firm understanding of how attribution shapes credibility and argument, you're perfectly positioned to explore how writers evaluate and select evidence in the first place, which is exactly where we're headed next. 5.4 Understand how to avoid plagiarism. Let's talk about something that trips up students not just on the AP exam, but in every piece of academic writing they'll ever do: plagiarism. And here's the thing. Most students who commit plagiarism don't do it because they're trying to cheat. They do it because they don't fully understand where the line is. So let's get crystal clear on exactly where that line sits. Because on the AP language exam, understanding plagiarism isn't just an ethical checkbox. It's a core skill that directly affects your synthesis and argument essay scores. What plagiarism actually is: think of ideas the way you think of property. If your neighbor builds a beautiful fence, you can admire it, describe it to someone else, even draw inspiration from it, but you can't tear it down, haul it to your yard, and call it yours. Plagiarism is essentially doing that with someone else's intellectual labor. The College Board defines plagiarism as presenting someone else's words, ideas, or work as your own without proper attribution. Notice that definition has 2 parts: words and ideas. That second part is where students get caught off guard. You can change every single word in a sentence and still plagiarize if you're lifting someone's original idea without credit. There are 3 forms of plagiarism you absolutely need to recognize for this exam. The first is direct plagiarism, copying someone's exact words without quotation marks or citation. That's the obvious one. The second is mosaic plagiarism, sometimes called patch writing, and this is the sneaky one. Mosaic plagiarism happens when you swap out a few words from a source, maybe swap significant for important, change passive voice to active voice, but keep the underlying structure and ideas without attribution. It looks original on the surface, but the intellectual architecture is stolen. The third is idea plagiarism, which means presenting someone's original concept, argument, or framework as if you invented it, even if your wording is completely different. Imagine someone spent years developing a theory about how social media affects teen cognition, and you describe their entire framework in your own words without ever mentioning them. That's still plagiarism. Paraphrasing versus plagiarizing, the critical distinction. This is where exam points are won and lost, so pay close attention. Paraphrasing is a legitimate and powerful writing strategy. It means restating someone else's idea in your own language and sentence structure with attribution. The with attribution part is non-negotiable. A proper paraphrase involves genuinely digesting the source material, stepping away from the original text, and reconstructing the idea in language that is authentically yours while still giving the original author credit. Here's a concrete way to feel the difference. Imagine a source says, "The proliferation of digital communication platforms has fundamentally altered the way adolescents construct their social identities." A mosaic plagiarist might write, "The growth of digital communication tools has basically changed how teenagers build their social identities." Different words, same sentence skeleton. That's plagiarism. A true paraphrase might look like, according to Dr. Martinez, teenagers today increasingly use social media as a primary arena for self-definition, a shift driven by the explosion of digital platforms. You've internalized the idea, expressed it differently, and given credit. That's legitimate scholarship. Citation and attribution on the AP exam. On the AP language exam, particularly in the synthesis essay, you are given sources and asked to incorporate them into your argument. The exam does not require you to use formal citation styles like MLA or APA. What it does require is clear attribution within your prose. This means you need to signal to the reader where an idea or quotation is coming from, using what the College Board calls source attribution. In practice, this looks like referring to sources by their labels, according to source C, or, as the author of source B argues, or, when authors are named in the source material, using their names directly. A common trap on the FRQ rubric is that students assume dropping a source label at the end of a sentence is enough. It isn't, if the integration is clunky or unclear. The scoring rubric rewards you for using sources as evidence in service of your argument, not just peppering citations throughout. Think of attribution as a handshake between your idea and the source's idea. You introduce the source, contextualize it, and then connect it back to your claim. Common mistakes and how to avoid them. One of the most frequent errors students make is what writing instructors call dropped quotes. Inserting a quotation into an essay without any introductory framing or follow-up analysis, even if you cite the source perfectly, a dropped quote can undermine your score because it suggests you're substituting the source's thinking for your own rather than using it to support your argument. The AP exam rewards analysis. Always introduce a quotation with context. Include the attribution and then immediately explain how that evidence connects to your claim. Another trap. Students sometimes over-rely on one source while neglecting others. For the synthesis essay, the College Board expects you to synthesize, meaning draw connections across multiple sources, not simply summarize one. Using at least 3 sources is the general standard for earning full synthesis credit, and the sources should be in conversation with each other through your argument, not standing in isolation. The ethical dimension the exam expects you to understand. AP language isn't just testing your mechanics, it's testing your rhetorical understanding of why attribution matters. When you cite a source, you're doing several things simultaneously. You're honoring the intellectual labor of the person whose work you're using. You're lending your own argument credibility by anchoring it to established evidence, and you're inviting your reader to verify and explore the ideas further. Attribution is, in a very real sense, a rhetorical move. It signals that you are a writer operating in good faith within a larger intellectual conversation. That framing connects directly to Unit 1's discussion of rhetorical situation and credibility. Your ethos as a writer is partly built through how transparently and accurately you handle sources. This topic also connects tightly to Unit 6, where you'll work with argument and counterargument. Properly attributed evidence strengthens your argumentative ethos. Unattributed or poorly handled evidence undermines it, even when the argument itself is sound. Understanding how to avoid plagiarism is ultimately about understanding what it means to join a conversation already in progress, with honesty, precision, and respect for the voices that came before yours. And with that foundation solidly in place, you're ready to explore how to evaluate the quality and credibility of the sources you're bringing into that conversation. 5.5 Synthesizing sources to support an original argument. Let's talk about what might be the single most important skill you'll demonstrate on the AP language exam: synthesis. If you've ever made a case to a friend by saying, "Look, I've got 3 different reasons this is true, and they all point to the same conclusion," congratulations, you've already synthesized. Now we just need to make that instinct precise, purposeful, and exam ready. What synthesis actually means. Here's the analogy I want you to hold on to for the rest of this section. Imagine you're a chef, not a grocery shopper. A grocery shopper picks up ingredients and drops them on the table. A chef transforms those ingredients into something that didn't exist before. Synthesis is the chef's work. When College Board uses the word synthesize, they mean you're taking multiple sources and creating something new from them, an original argument that you are driving, not one the sources are driving for you. This distinction is everything. Students who summarize each source one by one are grocery shoppers. Students who earn 5s are chefs. The AP language synthesis essay gives you 6 or 7 sources on a common topic, maybe the ethics of surveillance technology or the value of a liberal arts education, and asks you to write a persuasive essay that takes a clear position and draws on at least 3 of those sources as evidence. Your thesis is the North Star. Every source you bring in should illuminate that thesis, not replace it. The thesis comes first, always. Before you touch a single source, you need a defensible claim. College Board is explicit about this in their scoring rubrics. A strong synthesis response begins with a thesis that does more than restate the prompt. It takes a position. Think of it this way. If your thesis could work just as easily on the other side of the argument, it's too vague. Surveillance technology has both benefits and drawbacks is not a thesis. Surveillance technology, however well-intentioned, erodes the psychological freedom that democratic society depends on. Now, that's something you can actually argue, and more importantly, something the sources can meaningfully support. A very common MCQ and FRQ trap here is conflating a thesis with a topic sentence or a summary statement. The exam will test whether you recognize that a thesis must be arguable and specific. If you see an answer choice on a multiple-choice question that describes a thesis as presenting the main idea of the passage, that is wrong. A thesis makes a claim about that idea. How to integrate sources without losing your voice. Once your thesis is set, you're ready to bring in sources, but here's where most students stumble. They let the sources take over. They write a paragraph that is essentially a summary of source C, then a paragraph that is essentially a summary of source D, and somewhere in there they assume the argument is being made. It isn't. You have to tell the reader why each source matters to your argument. The technical term College Board uses is commentary. Commentary is your analysis of how the evidence supports your claim. Think of it as the mortar between bricks. The bricks are the sources. The mortar is your thinking. Without commentary, you have a pile of bricks, not a wall. On the FRQ rubric, failing to provide commentary, just quoting or paraphrasing without explaining the connection to your argument, is one of the most consistent reasons students lose points in the evidence and commentary row of the scoring guide. A practical method for building commentary is what I call the so what test. Every time you introduce a source, ask yourself, so what? So what that this source says surveillance cameras reduced crime in London? So what? The answer to that question is your commentary. This reduction in visible crime, however, tells us nothing about the internal surveillance citizens began performing on themselves, the self-censorship, the modified behavior, which is precisely the freedom my argument identifies as the most valuable casualty. Now you're synthesizing. Acknowledging complexity and counter-argument. Here is a nuance that separates good synthesis from great synthesis. You are allowed, encouraged actually, to use a source that complicates or even challenges your argument, as long as you account for it. This is called concession and refutation, and it appears in the rubric's discussion of sophistication. A student who pretends all sources agree with their thesis reads as naive. A student who says, "Source B appears to undercut my claim," but when examined more carefully, it actually reveals the limits of the opposing view, reads as intellectually mature. On the multiple-choice section, you'll often encounter questions that ask you to identify how a writer uses a source that seems to work against their point. The answer is almost never the writer ignores the contradiction. Strong writers engage the tension directly. Synthesis across the course. This skill doesn't live only in Unit 5. Synthesis connects directly to Unit 3, where you studied how writers build arguments from evidence and reasoning, and to Unit 4, where you analyzed how claims relate to each other. When you read rhetorically, asking why a writer chose this source, this moment, this framing, you are practicing the same analytical muscle synthesis requires you to flex in your own writing. The difference is that in your synthesis essay, you are the rhetorician. Synthesis also connects to the rhetorical situation concepts from Unit 1. Your sources are not neutral objects. They come from specific audiences, purposes, and contexts. A graph produced by a government agency and a personal essay written by a civil liberties attorney might both address surveillance, but they carry very different rhetorical weight. Acknowledging that weight, noting the ethos of a source, the purpose behind its production, adds a layer of sophistication that can push your essay into the highest scoring tier. The most common trap on the exam. I want to leave you with the single most dangerous mistake I see on synthesis essays. Treating synthesis as a research paper rather than a persuasive argument. A research paper neutrally presents information. A synthesis essay argues a position using sources as ammunition. If your essay reads like a Wikipedia article on your topic, balanced, informative, fair to all sides equally, you have not written a synthesis essay. You have written a summary with footnotes. Your argument must be audible in every paragraph. The sources should feel like allies you recruited to your cause, not authorities you are dutifully reporting. Mastering synthesis means you're always the writer in charge. And as we move into the next section, we'll look at how the choices you make at the sentence and paragraph level, your style, your transitions, your arrangement of ideas, can make that argument not just clear, but truly persuasive. 5.6. Integrating quotations, paraphrases, and summaries. The difference between dropping and weaving. Imagine you're telling a friend about a fascinating documentary you watched, and right in the middle of your story, you just stop. Play a 30-second clip from the documentary on your phone, then put it away and go silent. Your friend would be confused. What was that? Why did you show me that? How does it connect to what you were saying? That awkward, disconnected feeling is exactly what happens when a student drops a quotation into an essay without integrating it properly. The College Board calls this a dropped quotation, and it is one of the most penalized moves on both the synthesis and argumentative FRQs. Your job as a writer and as a strategic AP test taker is to weave your evidence into the fabric of your argument so seamlessly that the reader never loses the thread. Integration is not a stylistic nicety on the AP Lang FRQ scoring rubrics. Evidence and commentary are evaluated together. Readers are asking, does this student know why they're using this piece of evidence, and do they show that understanding through how they frame and explain it? The answer to that question lives entirely in how you integrate your sources. Quotations, when and how to use them. A direct quotation preserves the source's exact words, and you reach for one when those exact words carry irreplaceable weight, when the author's phrasing is unusually precise, rhetorically powerful, or when the specific language is itself the thing you're analyzing. Think of a quotation as a guest speaker you've invited into your essay. You wouldn't just throw open a door and shout, "Here's someone." You'd introduce them, explain who they are and why they're here, and then after they speak, you'd help the audience understand what to take away from the visit. The mechanics of that introduction are what the AP exam calls a signal phrase or attributive tag. Phrases like, as historian David Kennedy argues, or in her landmark study, researcher Sherry Turkle observes, do several things at once. They name the source, they establish credibility, and, crucially, the verb you choose signals your relationship to the material. There's a meaningful difference between Kennedy argues, Kennedy claims, Kennedy acknowledges, and Kennedy concedes. The College Board expects you to choose these verbs with intent. Argues and asserts imply the author is making a contestable point. Acknowledges and concedes imply the author is admitting something that might work against their position. Using these verbs precisely is a sign of rhetorical sophistication that scorers notice. After the quotation itself, you must provide commentary, your own sentence or sentences that explain what the quotation means, how it supports your claim, and why it matters to your argument. A useful rule of thumb. Your commentary should be at least as long as the quotation it follows, and often longer. Think of the quotation as a piece of evidence at trial. Your commentary is the lawyer's explanation of what that evidence proves. Without that explanation, the jury, your reader, is left to connect the dots themselves, and they may not connect them the way you intend. Paraphrase, the underrated workhorse. Paraphrase gets far less glamour than quotation, but on the AP exam it is your most versatile tool. A paraphrase restates a source's idea in your own words and sentence structure, at roughly the same length as the original. You use it when the idea matters, but the specific wording doesn't, when you want to show you've genuinely understood a complex point and can translate it into your own voice. For synthesis essays, especially where you're working with multiple sources across a 2-hour exam, paraphrase lets you move quickly and keep your own argument in the foreground. The common mistake students make is confusing a weak paraphrase with plagiarism. A weak paraphrase swaps out a few words while keeping the original sentence structure. Kennedy states that the historical record demonstrates widespread economic hardship is barely a paraphrase of, the historical record shows extensive economic suffering. You've changed almost nothing structurally. A genuine paraphrase restructures the idea from the ground up, translating the author's thought into your syntax, your vocabulary, your flow. Importantly, you still need a signal phrase, and you still need commentary. Evidence doesn't speak for itself just because it's in your words rather than the source's. Summary, the wide-angle lens. Summary condenses a larger section of a source, a whole article, a chapter, a complete argument into a few sentences capturing only the essential ideas. On the AP exam, you're most likely to use summary when you need to give context for a source before diving into a specific piece of it, or when one source's overall argument supports your thesis without requiring granular attention. Summary is the wide-angle lens. Quotation is the close-up. Know when each serves your purpose. The trap students fall into as summary is over-summarizing, spending so much of their essay retelling what sources say that they forget to make their own argument. The AP rubric explicitly penalizes essays that demonstrate inadequate commentary or that are primarily a summary of sources. Your sources are evidence for your claim, not the main event. The ICE framework and why it works. A practical framework that aligns perfectly with what AP scorers are looking for is ICE. Introduce, cite, explain. Introduce your evidence with a signal phrase that establishes the source and its relevance. Cite the evidence whether as a quotation, paraphrase, or summary. Explain the evidence with commentary that connects it back to your claim. When you're writing under timed conditions and anxiety is running high, ICE gives you a repeatable structure that keeps your paragraphs coherent. Think of it as the recipe card you've memorized so well that even under pressure your hands know what to do. Connections to the broader course. This skill threads through every unit in AP Lang. In Unit 3, when you analyze an author's rhetorical choices, you're quoting and explaining textual evidence to support your analysis. In Unit 6, you'll build argument essays that integrate your own reasoning with evidence from the world you know. The Synthesis FRQ in Unit 5 is essentially a test of whether you can weave together 3 to 5 sources into a single coherent argument, which is impossible to do well without mastery of integration. Even the multiple-choice passages test this skill indirectly. Questions about how an author uses evidence or how a paragraph functions are asking you to think about the very same relationship between claim, evidence, and commentary that integration demands. The most important thing to remember is this. Every piece of evidence you use is a promise to your reader that an explanation is coming. Honor that promise every time, and your essays will have the forward momentum that scores reward with top marks. With a solid command of how to bring evidence into your writing, you're ready to look at the larger structural question of how an entire argument is built and sustained, which is exactly where we're headed next. 5.7 Signal Phrases and Attribution. What signal phrases actually do? Imagine you're at a dinner party and someone suddenly blurts out, "The economy is going to collapse within 5 years." You'd probably look around, confused. Who said that? Why should I believe it? Is this your opinion or something you read? Now imagine. Instead, they said, according to economist Paul Krugman in his 2023 op-ed for the New York Times, the economy faces serious structural risks over the next decade. Totally different feeling, right? Suddenly you know where the idea came from. You can evaluate its credibility, and you understand how it fits into the conversation. That little introductory phrase, according to economist Paul Krugman, is a signal phrase, and it does a remarkable amount of work in a very small space. That's exactly what College Board wants you to understand about signal phrases and attribution. They are not decorative flourishes or academic politeness rituals. They are functional tools that control how your reader receives evidence. On the AP Lang exam, your ability to deploy them skillfully is tested directly in the free response questions, especially the synthesis essay and the argumentative essay, and your ability to analyze them is tested across the multiple-choice reading passages. The anatomy of a signal phrase. A signal phrase has 3 essential components that work together. First, there's the attribution, the identification of the source, which might be a person's name, a title, an institution, or a description of authority, like leading climatologists or a 2021 Pew Research study. Second, there's the verb, the word that characterizes what the source is doing. Third, there's the integration into your own sentence so that the quotation or paraphrase flows naturally rather than crashing into your prose like a car running a red light. The verb choice is where most students undersell themselves on the FRQ. If you write Jane McGonigal says that video games build resilience, you've used a neutral flat verb that conveys almost nothing about the rhetorical situation. But if you write Jane McGonigal argues that video games build resilience, you've signaled that this is a claim under contention. If you write McGonigal demonstrates through her research that video games build resilience, you've implied empirical evidence backs the point. The AP Lang rubric, particularly the sophistication and commentary dimensions, rewards students who choose signal verbs deliberately because it shows you understand the function of the evidence, not just its content. College Board groups signal verbs into several rhetorical categories you should have memorized. Verbs of assertion or argument include argues, contends, maintains, insists, posits. Verbs of explanation or clarification include explains, illustrates, clarifies, notes, observes. Verbs of agreement or support include confirms, echoes, supports, affirms, corroborates. Verbs of concession or acknowledgement include admits, concedes, grants, acknowledges. Verbs of questioning or challenging include questions, challenges, disputes, refutes, counters. Knowing which category fits your rhetorical purpose lets you telegraph your argument's logic before the reader even processes the evidence itself. Attribution and credibility. Attribution is not just citation, it's a credibility move. When you write according to Dr. Vivek Murthy, former U.S. Surgeon General, you're doing something strategic. You're preloading the reader's trust. The AP exam will ask you to analyze how authors of the passages do this, and it will ask you to do it yourself. Notice that skilled writers don't just name sources, they contextualize them. Harvard epidemiologist Dr. Mark Lipsitch tells you far more than just Dr. Lipsitch, and that additional context is doing rhetorical labor. A critical edge case to watch on the multiple choice. Attribution can also undermine credibility. When a writer attributes an opposing claim to a source the reader is likely to distrust, or describes the source in diminishing terms, think self-proclaimed experts or industry-funded researchers. This is a rhetorical move called loaded attribution, and you may be asked to identify its effect on tone or argument. Don't mistake it for neutral citation. Integration. Avoiding the floating quotation trap. One of the most common FRQ mistakes, and one that costs real points, is the floating quotation, also called a dropped quotation. This happens when a student pastes a quote into an essay with no signal phrase and no surrounding context, leaving it grammatically and rhetorically unanchored. The College Board scoring guides explicitly note that evidence which is not introduced, explained, or connected to the argument earns minimal credit. A signal phrase solves the introduction problem. Your commentary afterwards solves the explanation problem. Think of the quote as a guest at your dinner party. You need to introduce them before they speak, and you need to translate what they said for the other guests afterward. The technical formula for seamless integration looks like this: signal phrase with attribution plus verb plus quotation or paraphrase plus comma period plus your commentary connecting evidence to your claim. Your signal phrase should be grammatically continuous with the quoted material. McGonagall argues, games make us better works. McGonagall argues, games make us better, with a period break, creates a choppy, disconnected effect that weakens your writing score. Common MCQ traps and FRQ scoring points. On the multiple choice, you'll often be asked what effect a particular signal phrase or attribution has on the passage's tone, credibility, or argument. The trap is selecting an answer about the content of the quotation rather than the framing of it. Remember, the question is about the signal phrase's function, not the evidence itself. Train your eye to isolate the signal phrase and ask, what does this introductory language do to the reader's reception of what follows? For the FRQ, the most common scoring pitfall is using says or states for everything. Scoring guides at the higher tier reward nuanced commentary and precise verb choice. If you're summarizing a source that is making a causal claim, use contends or argues. If you're citing a study's findings, use demonstrates or reveals. If a source is qualifying a position, use acknowledges or concedes. This precision signals to the reader and to the AP reader scoring your essay that you understand the rhetorical relationship between sources and claims. Connections to the broader course. Signal phrases and attribution connect directly to Unit 4's work on rhetorical analysis, because understanding how a writer introduces evidence is part of analyzing their rhetorical choices. They also connect to Unit 6's work on argument, where the credibility and strategic placement of sources becomes part of your overall logos and ethos. When you cite a source, you are borrowing their ethos, their credibility, and lending it to your argument. That is an act of rhetoric, not just an act of documentation. With your signal phrase toolkit now fully stocked, you're ready to move into the next layer of argumentative craft. How to move from simply presenting evidence to actively synthesizing multiple sources into a unified, original argument of your own. 5.8 Evaluating source credibility and bias. Let's talk about something that sounds simple but trips up even the sharpest students on exam day: figuring out whether a source is actually worth trusting. Imagine you're about to make a major financial decision, say buying a used car, and someone hands you two pamphlets. One was written by an independent consumer safety organization. The other was produced by the dealership trying to sell you that car. Both documents might contain accurate statistics. Both might be polished and professional. But you'd read them very differently, wouldn't you? That instinct you're using, that quiet, skeptical radar, is exactly what College Board wants you to apply systematically on the AP language exam. What credibility actually means when the AP exam asks you to evaluate source credibility, it's asking you to assess whether a source is reliable, accurate, and worthy of being cited as evidence in an argument. Credibility is not the same as persuasiveness. A source can be beautifully written, emotionally compelling, and still factually shaky. And here's the trap many students fall into on multiple-choice questions. They confuse the quality of the writing with the quality of the evidence. Don't do it. Your job as a rhetorical analyst is to separate how a source argues from how trustworthy what it argues actually is. College Board expects you to evaluate credibility using a cluster of considerations. Think of them as the SIFT framework's more sophisticated cousin. You're looking at the author's expertise and credentials. Do they have relevant knowledge or training in the field they're speaking about? You're looking at the publication or platform. Is this an academic journal, a news organization with editorial oversight, a government agency, or someone's personal blog? You're looking at purpose. Was this source created to inform, to persuade, to sell, or to entertain? And you're looking at evidence quality. Does the source cite its own sources, use data transparently, and distinguish between fact and opinion? When all four of those align positively, you have a high credibility source. When one or more are questionable, you flag it. And more importantly, you explain why it matters for the argument being made. Understanding bias. It's not a dirty word. Here's where students often make a conceptual mistake. They think bias automatically disqualifies a source. It doesn't. Every source has a perspective, a point of view, a set of assumptions baked in. A study funded by a pharmaceutical company isn't automatically wrong. A personal essay by someone who survived a hurricane isn't automatically unreliable. Bias means a source may have a slant, a selective emphasis, or a vested interest. But your job is to identify and account for that bias, not to dismiss the source wholesale. The AP exam distinguishes between two broad categories of bias you need to recognize. The first is perspective or ideological bias, when a source consistently favors one political, social, or cultural viewpoint. Think of a think tank that has publicly stated its mission is to advance free market economic policies. Every data point they publish might be technically accurate, but their selection and framing of evidence will lean in a predictable direction. The second is conflict of interest or funding bias, when the entity producing or funding a source has a financial, professional, or personal stake in the outcome. The car dealership pamphlet is a perfect example. So is a nutrition study funded by a sugar industry trade group. You're not saying they lied, you're saying their interests create pressure toward particular conclusions, and a careful reader notes that, on free response questions, especially synthesis essays, you'll be expected to demonstrate this nuance explicitly. If you simply say, "This source is biased, so I won't use it," you'll lose points. The sophisticated move, the one that earns full rhetorical scores, is to say something like, although source C comes from an advocacy organization with a stated position on immigration reform, its underlying Census Bureau data remains relevant. However, readers should note the selective framing of that data in favor of the organization's policy goals. That's the AP language version of nuanced credibility evaluation. Practical signals to look for when you're working through the synthesis prompt sources in exam conditions and you have limited time. You need quick, reliable credibility signals. Look at the source attribution line that College Board always includes below each source. A peer-reviewed journal article signals high scholarly credibility. A newspaper op-ed signals opinion and perspective, not necessarily reported fact. A government data table signals high factual reliability for statistics. But remember that the framing of those statistics can still be politically shaped. An advertisement or promotional material signals that persuasion, not information, is the primary purpose. Watch especially for the expert testimony trap on multiple choice questions. A question might offer a quotation from someone with an impressive-sounding title. Dr. James Moore, Senior Fellow at the National Institute for Economic Growth, and ask you to evaluate its credibility. The trap is assuming that the title equals credibility. Your analysis should push deeper. What is the National Institute for Economic Growth? Is it a nonpartisan research body or an advocacy organization? What is Dr. Moore's specific area of expertise? Is he an economist commenting on economics or a chemist being asked about healthcare policy? Credentials matter only when they're relevant to the claim being made. Connecting this to the bigger picture. This section doesn't live in isolation. It connects directly to your work in Unit 3 on rhetorical analysis and to Unit 6 on argument. When you analyze an author's rhetorical choices, part of that analysis is understanding how they use sources. An author who cherry-picks only high-credibility sources that support their view and ignores credible countervailing evidence is making a strategic choice you should name. That's called selective evidence. And it's a form of rhetorical manipulation even when every individual source cited is technically credible. It also feeds directly into your synthesis essay performance. College Board Synthesis rubric rewards you for integrating sources strategically and acknowledging their limitations. Simply dropping a source into your argument as if its authority is beyond question is a flat, low-scoring move. Acknowledging the source's perspective, its potential bias, and the context of its production, and then explaining why it still supports your line of reasoning, is the mark of a sophisticated writer earning a 4 or a 5. One more thing worth burning into your memory. The difference between a primary and secondary source matters here. Primary sources, original data, first-hand accounts, original legislation, tend to have different credibility considerations than secondary sources which analyze or interpret primary material. Neither is automatically superior, but on the exam, knowing which type you're working with helps you frame your credibility evaluation more precisely. Now that you've sharpened your eye for what makes a source trustworthy and how to articulate its limitations without dismissing it entirely, you're ready to put all of this into action because in the next section, we'll look at exactly how to integrate these sources smoothly and strategically into your own written arguments. 5.9 Identifying agreements and disagreements among sources. Imagine you're at a dinner party where 5 guests are all talking about climate change. 2 of them agree that carbon emissions are the primary driver of global warming. One of those 2 also thinks nuclear energy is the solution, while the other is firmly against it. A 3rd guest doubts the human cause entirely, and the remaining 2 are somewhere in the middle, arguing about timelines and policy. Your job as the only person at the table who has read all 5 of their published essays beforehand is to map out exactly where they converge and where they split. That is precisely what College Board is asking you to do in Skill 5.9, and it's one of the most powerful analytical tools you'll carry into the Synthesis FRQ on exam day. What agreement and disagreement actually means. Before we go further, let's be precise about what College Board means by this skill because students routinely oversimplify it. Identifying agreements and disagreements among sources is not simply noticing that one author says yes and another says no. It's about locating the specific claims, evidence, values, and assumptions where sources align or diverge, and then understanding why those overlaps and tensions exist. The College Board's language here is intentional. They want you to analyze the relationship between sources, not just catalog their positions. Think of it like a Venn diagram in your head. You have source A and source B. Some of their ideas sit in the overlapping middle. Those are your agreements. But what lives in the outer regions of each circle, and more importantly, why does it live there? Is it because the sources are working from different data? Different values, different definitions of the same term? That why is what separates a score of 3 from a score of 5. The 4 dimensions of agreement and disagreement. Here's where you need to slow down and get methodical. When you're reading sources on the AP exam, whether in the synthesis prompt or in a rhetorical analysis passage, agreements and disagreements can operate on 4 distinct levels. The first is F, factual agreement or disagreement, where sources either cite compatible data or contradictory evidence. 2 sources might both agree that screen time among teenagers has increased, but disagree on whether the data shows harmful effects. The second level is interpretive agreement or disagreement, where sources share the same facts but draw different conclusions. This is the most commonly tested type, so pay special attention to it. The third is values-based disagreement, where sources prioritize different things, say individual freedom versus collective safety, and those different priorities lead them to incompatible recommendations even when they accept the same facts. The fourth is definitional disagreement, where sources are actually talking past each other because they define a key term differently. If one source defines poverty by absolute income and another uses a relative measure, they may seem to disagree when they're really just measuring different things. On the multiple choice section, College Board loves to present 2 paired passages and ask you to characterize their relationship. The wrong answers almost always pick the wrong type of relationship, so training yourself to recognize these 4 levels will save you from the most common trap, choosing the authors disagree, when really the authors agree on facts, but disagree on interpretation. How this shows up in the Synthesis FRQ? The synthesis essay is where this skill pays the biggest dividends. You'll be given 6 to 7 sources on a single topic and asked to take a position. The highest scoring essays don't just cherry-pick supportive quotes, they demonstrate an understanding of the conversation happening across all the sources. The scoring rubric rewards what College Board calls effective use of evidence, and one of the clearest paths to that score point is acknowledging where sources corroborate your claim and engaging seriously with sources that complicate or challenge it. Here's the practical technique. After your first read-through of the sources, quickly jot down the central claim of each one in a single sentence. Then look for sources that make the same claim from different angles. Those are your allies in an argument, and citing 2 sources that agree strengthens your point because it shows the idea holds across different contexts or types of evidence. Then find the source that most directly challenges your thesis. Engaging with that disagreement and explaining why your position still holds is the move that pushes a response into the upper scoring range. Common misconceptions and exam traps. One of the most persistent mistakes students make is treating partial agreement as full agreement. 2 sources might both support stricter environmental regulation, but one argues from economic efficiency and the other from moral obligation. On an FRQ, lumping them together as if they're saying the same thing misses the nuance College Board is explicitly rewarding. Always note how and why sources agree, not just that they agree. Another trap is false disagreement, assuming 2 sources conflict because their tones differ. A measured academic source and a passionate rhetorical source might actually be making identical claims about a policy outcome. They just sound different. Don't let ethos or tone fool you into manufacturing a disagreement that isn't there. Read for the underlying claim, not the surface texture of the prose. You should also watch out for what we might call the scope mismatch, where one source is making a narrow, specific claim, and another is making a broad, sweeping one. They might not technically disagree, but they're operating at different levels of generality, and treating them as equivalent can distort your argument. Acknowledging that difference is actually a mark of sophisticated analysis. Connections to other units. This skill doesn't exist in isolation. It connects directly to Unit 4's work on claims and evidence. To evaluate whether sources agree or disagree, you first need to be able to accurately identify what claim each source is actually making, which is the foundation of Units 3 and 4. It also feeds into Unit 6, where you'll be building your own arguments. Knowing where sources align gives you coalitions of evidence, and knowing where they diverge gives you the intellectual friction that makes argumentative writing interesting and credible. Even your rhetorical analysis work in Unit 2 is relevant, because understanding how an author constructs a claim helps you understand what they're actually asserting versus what they're merely implying. The ability to map agreements and disagreements is, at its core, the ability to think about ideas in relationship to each other rather than in isolation, and that's the heartbeat of everything AP Lang is asking you to do. Next up, we'll look at how to synthesize those agreements and disagreements into a coherent argument of your own, turning that dinner party map you just drew into a compelling, well-supported essay. 5.10. Using sources as conversation partners, not just evidence. Here's a scenario you've probably lived through. You're writing an essay. You've found a great quote from a credible source, so you drop it in, slap a citation on it, and move on. Done, right? Wrong. And this is exactly the trap that separates a 2 or 3 essay from a 5 essay on the AP language exam. The College Board has a very specific vision of what sophisticated argumentation looks like, and it centers on what we might call the conversation model of source use. So let's dig into what that actually means, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. The difference between evidence and conversation. Think about the last time you had a genuinely good conversation about something you care about. A debate with a friend about a movie, a discussion at the dinner table about something in the news. In those moments, you weren't just listing facts at each other. You were engaging with each other's ideas. Agreeing here, pushing back there, adding nuance, saying yes, but have you considered, That dynamic, the back and forth, the building and complicating of ideas, is exactly what the AP exam means when it asks you to use sources as conversation partners rather than mere evidence. When you treat a source as just evidence, you're essentially using another person's words as a prop. You find a quote that agrees with your point, you paste it in, and you walk away. The source is furniture in your essay. It looks nice, but it doesn't do any real work. When you treat a source as a conversation partner, you're actually engaging with the ideas that source contains. You're asking, what is this author really arguing? Where do I agree? Where do I see things differently? What does this source illuminate, and what does it leave out? The three moves, agree, complicate, counter. On the AP language exam, especially in the Synthesis FRQ, there are three intellectual moves you need to practice until they become second nature. Think of them as the grammar of academic conversation. The first move is agreeing and extending. This is when you bring in a source whose idea supports your claim, but instead of just parking the quote and walking away, you push the idea further. You might say something like, Author X argues that technology isolates individuals from their communities. This concern is well-founded, but what X doesn't fully explore is how that isolation often accelerates in economically precarious communities, where digital access doubles as a lifeline. You've agreed, but you've also moved the conversation somewhere new. The College Board's scoring rubric rewards this because it shows you're thinking, not just collecting. The second move is complicating. This is perhaps the most sophisticated rhetorical gesture you can make in an AP essay. And it's one that weaker writers almost never attempt to complicate a source, is to say this idea is valuable, and yet it gets more complex when we look at it from another angle. Imagine you're writing about the value of standardized testing. Source A argues, tests provide objective metrics. You don't dismiss that instead. You complicate it. While the objectivity that Source A describes is theoretically appealing, objectivity assumes that the test itself was designed without the cultural biases that researchers like Claude Steele have extensively documented. Notice that you're not rejecting Source A, you're deepening the conversation. The third move is respectful counter-argument. This is where you disagree with a source, but you do it with intellectual generosity. You acknowledge what the source gets right before you explain what it misses or gets wrong. Scorers specifically look for this because it signals that you understand argumentation is not about winning a shouting match, it's about pursuing truth. A line like Source C makes a compelling case for urban density as a climate solution, and yet it underestimates the infrastructural barriers facing mid-sized cities, shows that you've listened before you pushed back. The so what and the synthesis move. Here's a phrase to tattoo on the inside of your brain before exam day. So what? Every time you bring a source into your essay, ask yourself that question on behalf of your reader. You've cited the source. So what? Why does it matter? What does it add that wasn't there before? This is the move the College Board calls commentary, and it's where most students lose points. They quote, they cite, and then they immediately move on to the next point. But the score-earning move is the interpretive sentence or two that follows the evidence and explains its significance for your specific argument. Connected to this is the synthesis move itself, the ability to bring multiple sources into relationship with one another. The Synthesis FRQ requires you to use at least 3 sources, but a 5-level response doesn't just cite 3 sources sequentially. It shows how they speak to each other. Maybe Source A and Source B agree on a premise, but diverge on a solution. Maybe Source C complicates the optimism of Source A. When you articulate those relationships explicitly, using transitional language like while Source A emphasizes, Source D suggests a more cautionary view by you are demonstrating the kind of thinking that AP language is fundamentally designed to assess. Common traps and how to avoid them. The most common trap on the Synthesis FRQ is what you might call the buffet approach, where a student lines up sources one after another without any real connection between them. Source A says X, Source B says Y, Source C says Z. The essay reads like a book report, not an argument. Avoid this by writing your thesis first, and then asking which sources help you develop, complicate, or defend that thesis. Sources serve your argument. Your argument does not serve the sources. Another trap is overquoting. Long block quotations are almost never necessary on the AP exam, and they can actually hurt you by signaling that you're using the source as a crutch rather than engaging with it. Paraphrase when you can, and when you do quote directly, keep it brief and precise. Lift the key phrase, the specific word choice that matters, not the entire paragraph. A subtler trap is something called ventriloquism, putting words in a source's mouth. If you misrepresent what a source argues in order to make it fit your essay more neatly, a careful scorer will catch it, and it undermines your ethos as a writer. Engage with what the source actually says, even when it's inconvenient for your argument. Especially when it's inconvenient, actually, because that's where the most interesting thinking happens. Connections across the course. This concept connects deeply to Unit 3's work on rhetorical analysis and Unit 4's focus on claims and evidence. When you understand how real writers use evidence, how they frame it, qualify it, extend it, push back against it, you become a better analyst of those writers' techniques. It also connects to the argument essay in Unit 6, where the source is your own experience and observation, and the same conversational moves apply. Your own ideas need to be tested, complicated, and refined, not just asserted. Thinking of sources as conversation partners isn't just a test-taking strategy. It's the intellectual habit that college writing will demand of you from day one, which is precisely why College Board has made it central to this course. Coming up next, we'll look at how to smoothly integrate and attribute sources so that your essay's voice remains yours even as you're bringing in the voices of others. 5.11. Developing an argumentative position across multiple sources. The synthesis challenge, more than just a summary. Imagine you're planning a road trip with 3 friends, and each of them has a different opinion about the best route. One friend pulled up Google Maps, another printed out a AAA travel guide from 2019. The third just called their cousin who drove that highway last week. Your job isn't to repeat what each friend said. Your job is to figure out what to do and use their information to support that decision. That right there is synthesis. And in AP English Language and Composition, synthesis is one of the most heavily weighted skills on the entire exam. Section 5.11 is where everything you've been building, your understanding of rhetorical appeals, your ability to evaluate evidence, your skill at constructing claims comes together in one high-stakes task, developing and defending an argumentative position using multiple sources. This is the heart of the synthesis free response question, the first of the 3 FRQs you'll face on exam day, and mastering it is absolutely essential for scoring a 5. What College Board actually means by synthesis. Here's the first trap students fall into, and it costs them more points than almost anything else, confusing synthesis with summary. Synthesis is not a book report. You are not explaining what source A says, then what source B says, then what source C says. That kind of writing, sometimes called source stacking or drive-by citing, will land you squarely in the lower scoring range, no matter how accurately you've described the sources. Synthesis, in College Board's exact terminology, means that you're using sources as evidence to support, illustrate, complicate, or qualify your own argument. The key word there is your own. You have to take a position. You have to defend it. And you have to show how the sources you've chosen speak to that position, whether they directly support it, add nuance to it, or even introduce a counter-argument you need to address. Think of it like being a prosecuting attorney. The sources are your witnesses, but you're the one making the case. Building the argumentative position first. A mistake that feels logical, but is actually backwards. Reading all 6 or 7 sources before deciding what you think. When you do this, you tend to let the sources think for you, which leads right back to summary mode. Instead, treat the prompt itself as your starting point. The synthesis prompt will give you a topic, something like the role of social media in democracy or whether cities should invest in public transportation, and ask you to take a defensible position. Read the prompt carefully and ask yourself, what do I actually think about this? It doesn't have to be the most sophisticated position in the world, it just has to be yours, and it has to be arguable, meaning a reasonable person could disagree. Pollution is bad is not a defensible position because no one disagrees. Cities should prioritize reducing car dependency over expanding highway infrastructure. Now you've got something to argue. Once you have your position, you read the sources as a filter, not as a menu. You're asking each source, do you help me prove what I'm already trying to prove? Do you give me something I need to address? This keeps you in the driver's seat argumentatively. Integrating sources with sophistication. The College Board Synthesis rubric, which you must internalize, awards the evidence and commentary row based on how effectively you use your sources. Using 3 or more sources to support your argument earns you higher marks. But the word use matters enormously. Every time you bring in a source, you need to do 3 things. Introduce it in context, deploy it as evidence, and then, this is the part most students skip, explain what it proves. That explanation connecting the source back to your claim is called commentary, and it is the engine of a strong synthesis essay. Think of it this way. If the source is a brick, commentary is the mortar. A wall made of bricks with no mortar just falls over. You need that explanatory tissue between your evidence and your argument, or the whole structure collapses. A common MCQ trap, and this transfers directly to FRQ thinking, involves identifying whether a passage is supporting an argument, conceding a counterargument, or refuting a counterargument. These are different rhetorical moves, and you need to distinguish them. Supporting means the source directly backs your claim. Conceding means you acknowledge that an opposing source has a valid point, even as you maintain your overall position. Refuting means you argue that an opposing source is wrong or limited. The most sophisticated synthesis essays use all 3 moves. They don't just pile up sources that agree with them. Qualifying your argument and addressing complexity. Here's where synthesis at the highest level diverges from synthesis at the middle level. A score 6 essay in the old rubric, or a full credit response now, doesn't just argue a single line with sources attached. It complicates its argument. It acknowledges where the picture gets muddy. If you're arguing that social media has been harmful to democratic discourse, and one of the sources presents evidence that social media helped organize pro-democracy movements in authoritarian countries, you don't ignore that source, you grapple with it. You might say, while source D illustrates cases in which social media facilitated democratic organizing, this benefit must be weighed against the systemic amplification of misinformation documented in sources B and F. That's a qualifying move, and it signals to the AP reader that you're thinking like a scholar, not a debater who only hears one side. This connects directly to Unit 3's work on counterargument and Unit 4's exploration of how context shapes meaning. When you bring in a source that complicates your thesis, you're not weakening your argument. You're demonstrating that your argument can hold up under pressure. Terminology, traps, and what readers look for. Use College Board's exact language when writing and thinking about synthesis. Defensible thesis, evidence, commentary, line of reasoning, qualification, complexity. These aren't just buzzwords. They map directly to rubric rows, and readers are literally checking for them. Your thesis must appear in the introduction and take a clear, specific position. Not, there are many perspectives on this issue, which is the single most common thesis trap and earns 0 thesis credit. Your line of reasoning refers to the logical structure of your argument across the whole essay, how each body paragraph advances a distinct reason in support of your central claim rather than just introducing a new source. One final trap to watch for in both MCQs and your own writing. Over-relying on personal anecdote at the expense of sources, or over-relying on sources at the expense of your own analytical voice. Balance is everything. The sources serve you. You don't serve the sources. As you move forward, you'll want to see how these synthesis skills connect to the argumentative essay prompt, where you develop a position without provided sources entirely, testing whether the reasoning strategies you've just built can stand entirely on their own. 5.12 The Synthesis FRQ, Understanding the Prompt and Task. Let's talk about the synthesis free response question, the one that tends to make students either feel like seasoned debaters or like they've been handed a jigsaw puzzle with no picture on the box. Here's the good news. Once you understand exactly what the prompt is asking you to do and why it's designed that way, the whole task becomes far less mysterious. Think of this section as learning the rules of a game before you sit down to play. You wouldn't walk onto a basketball court without knowing what counts as a foul, right? Same principle here. What the Synthesis FRQ actually is. The Synthesis FRQ is one of 3 free response questions on the AP English Language exam, and it's always the first one you encounter in that section. You're given a set of sources, typically 6 to 8 of them, that all orbit a central topic or issue. These sources might include articles, essays, charts, graphs, photographs, cartoons, or even excerpts from speeches. Your job is to read them, identify useful evidence, and then write a persuasive argument that takes a defensible position on the prompt's question or issue, drawing on at least 3 of those provided sources to support, illustrate, or complicate your reasoning. Notice that word synthesize. It comes from the Greek word meaning to put together, and that's precisely your task, not just summarizing what sources say, but weaving them into an argument that is fundamentally your own. Think of yourself as a lawyer building a case. You don't just read depositions aloud, you select the most compelling evidence and arrange it to support the argument you're making. The sources are your witnesses. You decide who testifies, in what order, and what their testimony proves. Dissecting the prompt itself, every Synthesis FRQ prompt follows a recognizable structure, and understanding that structure is genuinely half the battle. The prompt will open with a brief contextual paragraph that introduces the topic, something like the ethics of social media, the value of space exploration, or the role of standardized testing. This context is not decorative. It's designed to give you a conceptual frame before you dive into the sources, so read it carefully. Students who skip this setup often write responses that are technically about the topic but miss the specific angle or tension the prompt is setting up. After the context, you'll see the actual task directive, which typically uses language like, write an essay that argues your position on the issue and synthesizes at least 3 of the provided sources. The College Board is very deliberate about that verb argue. This is not an expository essay asking you to explain multiple perspectives neutrally. It is not a compare and contrast essay. It is an argumentative essay where you take a clear, defensible position and use sources as evidence in service of that position. This distinction matters enormously for scoring. The 3-source requirement and why it's a floor, not a ceiling. Here's one of the most common traps students fall into, treating the at least 3 sources requirement as a target rather than a minimum. Citing exactly 3 sources and nothing else is the rhetorical equivalent of answering your teacher's question with the fewest possible words, technically correct, but not impressive. Stronger essays typically engage with 4 or 5 sources because doing so demonstrates that you can manage complexity and that your argument is robust enough to hold up against multiple pieces of evidence. Think of it this way. If you're arguing that remote work improves productivity, citing 1 study feels weak, citing 3 or 4, including 1 that raises a complication you then address, makes you sound like someone who actually knows what they're talking about. That said, quality of engagement always outweighs quantity. A shallow reference to 5 sources is worth far less than a deep, analytical engagement with 3. The College Board rubric rewards commentary, the reasoning you provide after you introduce a source, more than mere citation. What synthesis means and what it doesn't. This is arguably the most misunderstood concept in the entire FRQ. Synthesis does not mean quoting a source, summarizing it, and moving on to the next one. That's a patchwork, not an argument. True synthesis means that you're integrating source material into a line of reasoning that you control. Imagine you're making a documentary film. The source material is your footage. Synthesis is the act of editing, deciding what to include, what to cut, and most importantly, how each piece of footage advances the story you're telling. The narrative is yours. A helpful self-check. After each source reference in your essay, ask yourself whether a reader could understand why you included it without reading the source themselves. If the answer is no, you've summarized. If the answer is yes, because your commentary has explained the source's relevance to your specific claim, you've synthesized. Connections to the broader course. The Synthesis FRQ doesn't exist in isolation. It draws on nearly every skill you've developed across the entire AP English language course. Your work with rhetorical analysis in earlier units trained you to read sources critically and notice how writers construct arguments, which now helps you evaluate which sources are most credible and persuasive. Your understanding of claims, evidence, and commentary from Unit 5's earlier lessons is the backbone of how you structure your own argument. Even the close reading skills from Unit 1 matter here, because you need to extract specific, precise evidence from sources rather than paraphrasing loosely. One concept that connects especially tightly to this task is the idea of counter-argument and concession, which you'll explore more fully in upcoming lessons. The strongest synthesis essays don't pretend that all sources agree with the writer's position. They acknowledge tension, maybe one source complicates the argument, and then explain why the overall position still holds. This nuanced handling of conflicting evidence is precisely what earns top scores on the rubric. The most common mistakes to avoid? Let's name a few traps directly so you can sidestep them. First, don't list sources instead of arguing source A says X, source B says Y, source C says Z is three summaries stapled together, not an essay. Second, don't treat the sources as a script. Your voice and reasoning must be the dominant presence. Third, don't bury your thesis or delay it past the first paragraph. Readers need to know your position from the start. Fourth, avoid vague attribution like one source or the article. Cite them using the designation provided source A, source B, or the author's name if given, which is both cleaner and more credible. Understanding the prompt and its demands is your foundation, and everything else, how you structure your argument, how you quote and attribute sources, how you build toward a compelling conclusion, rests on that foundation. Now that you know what the task is asking, let's look at how to actually build a synthesis essay from the ground up, starting with how to read those sources strategically under timed conditions. 5.13 Reading and annotating the 6 to 7 synthesis sources. Let's talk about one of the most misunderstood moments in the entire AP English language exam, the 20-minute reading period before you write your synthesis essay. Most students treat this time like a waiting room. They flip through the sources, vaguely skim, maybe underline a sentence or two, and then sit back thinking they've done the work. They haven't. And that's exactly why so many synthesis essays end up feeling thin, underdeveloped, or, the cardinal sin in the AP reader's eyes, like a patchwork quilt of summaries stitched together without a real argument. Today we're going to fix that. What the synthesis task is actually asking you to do, before we talk about how to read the sources, you need to understand what you're reading for. The synthesis essay asks you to take a position on a debatable issue and support that position using evidence from at least 3 of the 6 or 7 provided sources. Notice that the College Board says at least 3, but the students who score 4s and 5s almost always use 4 or 5 sources, and they use them strategically. You're not summarizing the sources, you're not reporting what each author said, you're building an argument, and the sources are your raw material. Think of yourself less like a journalist writing a roundup article and more like a lawyer assembling evidence before trial. You know the verdict you want to argue toward, and you're selecting the most compelling pieces of evidence to support it. How to use the 20-minute reading period. The clock starts and you have 20 minutes before you're permitted to begin writing. This is not downtime, this is strategy time, and every second counts. The very first thing you should do before you read a single source is read the prompt itself twice. The prompt contains the essential context, the issue at stake, and crucially the specific question you must answer. Many students get halfway through the sources before they realize they've been reading for the wrong angle. Circle or underline the key tension in the prompt. If the prompt asks whether cities should invest in public parks, your brain should immediately shift into argument mode. What are the competing values here? Cost versus benefit, private use versus public good, individual freedom versus community welfare. Naming those tensions before you read helps your brain act like a filter, not a sponge. Annotating with a purpose, the 3-category system. Now you're ready to read the sources, and here's where annotation becomes your superpower. The most effective technique, the one that directly feeds your essay, is to annotate with a 3-category system as you go. You're looking for three things in every source: evidence that supports a position, evidence that complicates or qualifies a position, and evidence that you can push back against. Think of it like color coding without the colors. When you find a strong statistic, a compelling anecdote, or an expert claim that could anchor a body paragraph, put a simple S in the margin for support. When you find something more nuanced, a concession, a caveat, or a surprising twist, mark it C for complicates. When you find a claim that seems weak, biased, or that your argument would need to counter, mark it P for pushback. This system takes about 2 seconds per annotation, but it transforms your sources from a pile of text into an organized toolkit. Reading across sources, not just through them. Here's the insight that separates strong scorers from average ones. You should be reading the sources in conversation with each other, not just reading each one in isolation. As you move from source B to source C, you should be asking yourself, does this agree with, contradict, or add nuance to what I just read? If source A is a newspaper editorial arguing that social media harms teenagers, and source C is a study showing that teenagers who use social media to maintain friendships report higher life satisfaction, those two sources are in tension, and that tension is essay gold. Jot a quick note in the margin of source C like contradicts A, or draw a little bracket, and write the letter of the related source. These cross-source connections are exactly what the rubric rewards when it talks about effectively synthesizing sources rather than merely citing them. Paying attention to source context and bias, each source in the AP exam comes with a brief header, a citation telling you who wrote it, where it was published, and when. Do not skip this. The College Board includes these headers for a reason, and sophisticated readers use them strategically. A source from an industry-funded think tank has a different credibility profile than a peer-reviewed academic study. An op-ed written by a practicing surgeon carries different rhetorical weight than one written by a political commentator. You don't need to write a full rhetorical analysis of each source during the reading period, but you should develop a quick sense of the source's perspective and potential bias, because when you cite sources in your essay, acknowledging a source's limitations while still using its evidence is a hallmark of the sophisticated writer, the one scoring a 5. Common traps and misconceptions. The biggest trap students fall into during the reading period is spending too long on any single source. If a source is particularly dense, a technical graph, a long policy document, don't let it swallow your entire reading window. Skim it, mark the most usable data point, and move on. You can always return briefly during the writing phase. Another common mistake is trying to plan your entire essay structure during the reading period. Resist this. Your job during reading is to gather and organize evidence, not to write topic sentences in your head. The argument will crystallize faster than you expect once you start writing. Connections to other units. This skill doesn't live in isolation. It connects directly back to Units 1 through 3, where you practice close reading and rhetorical analysis. The same eye you developed for identifying an author's claim, evidence, and rhetorical choices is the exact eye you need here. You're also drawing on Unit 4's work with argument structure, because understanding how arguments are built helps you evaluate the strength of the evidence you're reading. And of course, everything in this unit, Unit 5, has been building toward this moment. The synthesis essay is where claim-making, evidence selection, and source integration all converge. A final word before you write. Think of the 6 or 7 sources as a panel of expert witnesses. Some support your case, some complicate it, and 1 or 2 might actually seem to argue against you. But even those can be useful if you address and rebut them thoughtfully. Your job in the next 20 minutes is to know your witnesses before you put them on the stand. With your sources annotated and your argument taking shape, it's time to talk about how you actually build that synthesis essay from the ground up, which brings us to our next topic, developing a strong, defensible thesis for the synthesis question. 5.14, Developing a defensible thesis for the Synthesis FRQ. What the Synthesis FRQ is actually asking you to do, let's set the scene. You sit down on exam day, flip to the free response section, and the first thing you encounter is the Synthesis FRQ, 6 sources sitting in front of you like a dinner party where everyone has a slightly different opinion. Your job isn't to summarize what each guest said. Your job is to walk into that party, look at all those opinions, and say something original, something smart, something arguable, something that uses those guests as evidence for your point. That original something, that's your thesis. And if you don't get the thesis right, everything else you write in that essay is building on sand. The College Board is explicit about what a defensible thesis does. It establishes a line of reasoning, not merely a restatement of the prompt. This distinction is the single most important thing to understand about the Synthesis FRQ, and it's the place where most students leave points on the table. What defensible actually means. Think of the word defensible the way a lawyer thinks about it. If someone challenged your claim in open court, could you defend it with evidence? A claim like social media has some positive and some negative effects isn't defensible. It's just true, obviously, unambiguously true, and therefore totally uninteresting to argue. A defensible claim takes a specific position on a complex issue. It says something that a reasonable person might push back on, which means you have to do intellectual work to prove it. Here's an analogy. Imagine your friend asks you what you think of a movie. If you say, well, some parts were good and some parts weren't, your friend learns nothing and might reasonably want their money back for that conversation. But if you say that movie's twist ending actually undermines everything the first 2 acts built, and here's why that matters, now that's something to talk about. That's a defensible position. Your synthesis thesis needs to be the second version every single time. The anatomy of a thesis that scores. The College Board rubric awards 1 point for the thesis and commentary, and that point lives or dies on 2 things working together, your claim and your reasoning. The claim is your position. The reasoning is the logical framework that makes your claim make sense. It answers the implicit question, why should I believe you, without you having to say the words, I believe. A strong synthesis thesis typically does 3 things in 1 to 3 sentences. First, it acknowledges the complexity of the issue, not by waffling, but by demonstrating that you understand stakes are involved. Second, it commits to a clear, specific position. Third, it gestures toward the logic that will govern the rest of your essay. You don't have to preview every body paragraph, but you do need to give readers a sense of why your position holds up. A common formula students find useful sounds like this. Although concession to complexity or counter-argument, your specific claim because the core reasoning or framework you'll use, that although at the front shows intellectual sophistication, you're not ignoring the other side, you're absorbing it and still standing firm, that because at the end is your logical engine, the thing that powers everything you're about to write. What the rubric rewards and what it penalizes. The scoring rubric for the AP Lang Synthesis FRQ uses precise language you should know cold. A thesis that merely restates the prompt earns 0 points for that criterion, and this is the most common trap. If the prompt asks you to develop a position on whether cities should invest in public transportation, and your thesis says there are many arguments for and against investing in public transportation, you have essentially repeated the prompt back in different words. That's a 0. Similarly, a thesis that only summarizes the sources. According to sources A, B, and C, public transportation has many benefits, also earns 0, because you haven't actually made a claim. You've made a report. Reports don't score thesis points. What earns the point is a thesis that responds to the prompt with a specific arguable position and establishes a line of reasoning. Notice that phrase, line of reasoning. College Board uses it across the entire AP Lang rubric, and it connects directly to Unit 4's work on argument structure and to Unit 3's work on how claims, evidence, and commentary work together. Your thesis is essentially a promise. Here's the claim I'm making, and here's the logical architecture I'll use to support it throughout this essay. Where students go wrong, the 2 big traps. The first trap is what you might call the both sides thesis. Students who feel uncertain about taking a strong position sometimes write something like, public transportation has both advantages and disadvantages, and cities must weigh them carefully. This feels safe, but it's intellectually empty. There's no position to defend, so the rest of the essay becomes a list of pros and cons with no argumentative spine. Avoid this completely. The second trap is writing a thesis that's technically a position, but is so broad it could apply to anything. Infrastructure investment is important for society. Sounds sophisticated, but is essentially meaningless in the context of a specific, nuanced prompt. Your thesis needs to respond to the specific question being asked, using the specific stakes the prompt sets up. Connecting your thesis to the sources. One thing that makes the Synthesis FRQ unique, and uniquely tricky, is that you have to use sources, but your thesis can't be enslaved to them. You should form your position after reading the sources, letting them inform your thinking, but your thesis should feel like yours, not a committee decision made by whichever sources happen to agree with each other. Think of the sources as witnesses you're calling to support your argument. You're the attorney. The thesis is your opening statement. You know what verdict you're arguing for before you call a single witness. This connects directly to the commentary criterion in the scoring rubric, which is where you demonstrate that you understand how evidence functions in an argument, a skill you've been building since Unit 1. A strong thesis makes the commentary work easier, because every time you use a source, you already know exactly what job it's doing in your larger logical framework. A quick gut check before you write. Before you commit your thesis to paper, ask yourself 3 questions. Can someone reasonably disagree with this? If no, it's not defensible. Does this respond specifically to what the prompt is asking? If no, it's off topic. Does this give me something to prove, not just describe? If no, you have a topic sentence, not a thesis. As you move forward in your exam prep, keep in mind that the thesis skills you're sharpening here for the Synthesis FRQ are the exact same skills the rhetorical analysis and argument FRQs demand, which is why in our next section, we'll look at how to build the line of reasoning that your thesis promises, developing the body paragraphs that make your argument genuinely persuasive from start to finish. 5.15 Commentary and Explanation, moving beyond, quote, dropping. What, quote, dropping is and why it fails. Let's start with a scene you've probably lived through. You're writing a timed essay, you've got a great piece of evidence lined up, and you're running out of time. So you do this. You plant the quote in the middle of your paragraph and immediately move on to your next point. Done, evidence cited. Moving on. Except, and here's the thing, you haven't actually done the work yet. You've just dropped a quote onto the page like someone leaving a mysterious package on a doorstep with no explanation, no sender, no instructions. The reader is left staring at it, wondering what it means and why it's there. College Board calls this quote dropping, and it is one of the most common and costly mistakes students make on the AP language exam, particularly on the synthesis and argument FRQs. A quote drop happens when you include evidence, whether it's a direct quotation, a paraphrase, or a summary, without following it with substantive analysis that explains its meaning and connects it to your claim. The quote just sits there, doing nothing. You might be thinking, but the reader can figure out why the quote is relevant. Here's the hard truth. On the AP exam, your job is not to make the reader figure anything out. Your job is to make the argument so clearly and completely that there is no ambiguity left. The College Board scorers are explicitly looking for the analytical bridge between evidence and claim, and if it's missing, you will not reach the higher scoring levels on the rubric. The analytical bridge, what commentary actually does. Think of your paragraph like a 3-part conversation. Your claim makes a promise to the reader. It says, I'm going to prove this. Your evidence shows up and says, here's something real and concrete that matters. But the evidence can't speak for itself. It doesn't know what argument you're making. That's the whole job of commentary. It's the translator. Commentary explains what the evidence means, why it matters for your specific argument, and how it supports the claim you made at the top of the paragraph. Here's an analogy that might stick with you. Imagine you're a lawyer presenting Exhibit A to a jury. You don't just hand a photograph to the jury foreman and sit down. You walk the jury through it. Notice here that the timestamp reads 11:47 p.m. This matters because the defendant claimed to be across town at midnight. The photograph places him at the scene less than 15 minutes before the crime was committed. That explanation connecting the specific detail to the larger claim is exactly what commentary does in a paragraph. The photograph alone proves nothing. The lawyer's explanation makes it devastating. The 2 layers of commentary College Board expects for the AP exam. There are 2 distinct moves your commentary needs to make, and understanding both is essential for scoring in the top tier of the rubric. The first move is explanation. You tell the reader what the evidence means on its own terms. This is where you unpack any ambiguity, define terms if necessary, or clarify exactly what the author or data source is saying. Think of this as translation. You're making sure the reader understands the evidence the same way you do. The second move is connection. You explain why this evidence supports your specific claim. This is the argumentative engine of the paragraph. It's where you say, in effect, and because of this, my argument holds. Here's why. This second layer is what separates competent writers from sophisticated ones on the AP rubric. Many students do the first layer and think they're done. But without the second layer, the explicit logical bridge back to your thesis, you haven't made an argument, you've made a summary. The so what test and the because method. 2 practical tools will help you catch commentary failures before they cost you points. The first is the so what test. After every piece of evidence you include, ask yourself out loud, so what? Why does this matter? What does this prove? If you cannot immediately answer that question in writing, you haven't finished your commentary. The so what is not optional. It is the point of the paragraph. The second tool is the because method, which works as a self-check on the logical connection between claim and evidence. Try completing this sentence structure. This evidence supports my claim that thesis point because your analytical reasoning. If you struggle to fill in the because naturally and specifically, you either have a weak claim, weak evidence, or most likely insufficient commentary. The because is where your original thinking lives. Common AP exam traps and rubric considerations. On the FRQ scoring rubric, College Board distinguishes between papers that merely assert and papers that explain or demonstrate. Those words are not decorative. They are the line between a score of 3 to 4 and a score of 5 to 6. A paragraph that asserts a connection, this quote shows how dangerous plastic waste is, will not score as high as a paragraph that explains the mechanism of that connection by citing the rate of microplastic ingestion in marine species over a 40-year span. The author quantifies what was previously dismissed as anecdote, transforming public perception from vague concern to documented emergency, which is precisely the rhetorical strategy of building pathos on a foundation of logos. One trap students fall into consistently is confusing length with depth. Writing 3 sentences of commentary is not automatically better than writing 1 sentence if those 3 sentences are just restating the evidence 3 different ways. Commentary requires genuine analytical movement. Each sentence should add a new layer of understanding, not simply repeat what the quote already said in different words. That repetition without progression is sometimes called padding, and experienced scorers recognize it immediately. Another trap involves paraphrased evidence specifically. Students sometimes feel that because they paraphrased instead of quoting directly, they have already done analytical work. They haven't. Paraphrasing is a skill, but it's a source handling skill, not an analytical one. Even paraphrased evidence requires full commentary. Connections across the course. This skill doesn't live in isolation. Commentary is the engine behind the rhetorical analysis essay as well. When you identify an appeal to ethos in Unit 2, or analyze a writer's diction and syntax choices from Units 3 and 4, the identification alone is worth very little. It's the explanation of effect, why that choice in that moment on that audience, that constitutes actual analysis. Similarly, in the synthesis essay from Unit 6, commentary is what separates students who use sources as wallpaper from students who use sources as evidence in a genuine argument. The moment you internalize that evidence is never self-explanatory, that your voice, your reasoning, your analytical work is always the point, you stop dropping quotes and start making arguments. Speaking of making arguments, next we'll look at how all of these paragraph-level skills, claim, evidence, and commentary, come together to build a coherent, multi-paragraph essay structure that holds its logic from the introduction all the way through to the conclusion. 5.16 Sophistication in Synthesis, acknowledging complexity and tension among sources. What sophistication actually means on the AP exam. Let's talk about the word that separates a score of 4 from a score of 5. Sophistication. College Board uses this word deliberately, and it does not mean using fancy vocabulary or writing long sentences. Sophistication in the context of the AP language synthesis essay means demonstrating that you understand reality is messy, that smart people disagree, and that you can hold multiple truths in tension without collapsing them into a single tidy answer. Think of it this way. A child says broccoli is bad. A sophisticated thinker says broccoli contains compounds that are genuinely bitter to some people due to genetic taste receptors, and yet its nutritional profile makes it worth acquiring the taste, though accessibility and food culture complicate even that recommendation. That's sophistication. You're not dodging the question, you're honoring its actual complexity. On the AP exam rubric, the sophistication point is the hardest to earn and the most commonly misunderstood. It is awarded when your argument demonstrates a complex understanding of the rhetorical situation, and one of the most reliable ways to earn it in a synthesis essay is by explicitly acknowledging the tensions, contradictions, and limitations that exist among your sources. This is the skill section 5.16 is training you to perform. The idea of productive tension. Here's an analogy that might help this click. Imagine you're a documentary filmmaker interviewing 6 people about whether social media is good for democracy. 3 of them give you passionate arguments that it amplifies marginalized voices and organizes civic action. 3 others give you equally passionate arguments that it spreads misinformation and deepens polarization. A lazy filmmaker cuts together one side and ignores the other. An average filmmaker presents both sides neutrally and says it's complicated. A sophisticated filmmaker notices that both groups are actually right, but about different populations, different platforms, and different political contexts, and builds a documentary that shows exactly why both claims can be simultaneously true without either canceling the other out. That documentary filmmaker is who College Board wants you to be in your synthesis essay. You are not a debate judge picking a winner. You are an analyst who recognizes that Source B's optimism about technology is not simply wrong just because Source D contradicts it. Instead, you identify the specific condition or context under which each source's claim holds, and you use that insight to build a more precise argument than either source alone could support. How to identify tension among sources. Before you can acknowledge tension, you have to see it. During your 15-minute reading period, and this is critical, you should be doing more than summarizing each source. You should be mapping relationships. Ask yourself, do any 2 sources share a goal but disagree about the method? Do any 2 sources use the same data but reach opposite conclusions? Does one source's optimistic claim depend on a condition that another source shows is rarely met in the real world? These are the fault lines where sophistication lives. The AP exam will consistently give you source sets designed with built-in friction. One source might argue that urban green spaces improve mental health outcomes. Another might argue that the communities who need green spaces most are the ones least likely to have access to them. A surface-level essay treats these as 2 separate points to cite. A sophisticated essay recognizes that the tension between them is the real argument. Green spaces work. But working and being equitable are not the same thing, and your thesis should reflect that distinction. 3 moves that earn the sophistication point. There are 3 specific rhetorical moves you should practice until they become instinctive. The first is conceding and then complicating. This is where you acknowledge a source's valid claim and then immediately introduce a source that reveals its limitation. A sentence like, while Source C correctly identifies that increased transparency builds public trust, Source E demonstrates that transparency without accountability mechanisms can actually entrench existing power imbalances, rather than correct them, is doing exactly this work. You're not saying Source C is wrong, you're saying its claim is incomplete without Source E's qualifier. The second move is identifying the underlying assumption. Every source argument rests on assumptions, and sophisticated writers name them. If source A argues that standardized testing measures merit, your sophistication move is to locate the assumption buried inside that claim, that merit is uniformly defined, or that preparation resources are equally distributed, and cite another source that challenges that assumption directly. This move tells the reader that you're not just processing information, you're analyzing the architecture of each argument. The third move is synthesizing across tensions to produce a more nuanced claim. This is the highest level version, and it's what College Board is really looking for. Instead of simply noting that source B and source F disagree, you use their disagreement to arrive somewhere neither source went alone. The tension becomes generative. It produces a thesis with more precision than any single source could offer. This is the joining a conversation model of synthesis, where you don't just report what others said, but use their dialogue to build something new. Common traps and how to avoid them. The most dangerous trap on this skill is what examiners sometimes call source stacking, listing sources that all agree with each other to support a single, uncomplicated point. If every source you cite says essentially the same thing, you are not synthesizing, you are summarizing with extra steps. The rubric explicitly rewards using sources in ways that engage with complexity. So a thesis that cannot accommodate any contradiction is a thesis that cannot earn the sophistication point. Another trap is the false balance fallacy, which is almost the opposite problem. Some students, trying to appear sophisticated, present both sides as equally valid when the source material actually weighs more heavily in one direction. Sophistication is not the same as neutrality. You are still expected to have and defend a position. You're just expected to defend it in a way that accounts for the strongest counter-arguments. Acknowledging complexity does not mean abandoning your claim, it means fortifying it. Be especially careful not to treat concession as your conclusion. A paragraph that ends with, "However, this issue is very complex and there are many perspectives," earns nothing. Complexity must be a launching pad, not a landing pad. You acknowledge the tension, and then you do something with it. Connections across the course. This skill connects deeply to the rhetorical analysis work you practiced in Units 3 and 4, where you examined how writers themselves acknowledge counter-arguments to strengthen their ethos and logos. It also connects to the argumentation skills from Unit 6, where you'll be constructing your own arguments without provided sources, and where the same sophistication standard applies. Every time College Board asks you to write, it is asking the same underlying question: can you think with nuance? Section 5.16 is the synthesis essay's answer to that question. Understanding how to navigate tension among sources also connects to the concept of rhetorical context from Unit 1, because often the reason two sources disagree is that they were written for different audiences at different moments with different purposes. And naming those contextual differences is itself a mark of sophisticated thinking. With your understanding of how to navigate tension and complexity among sources now firmly in place, you're ready to explore how effective synthesis arguments are structured and sequenced at the paragraph and essay level. 5.17. Scoring the Synthesis FRQ, understanding the rubric, thesis, evidence and commentary, sophistication. Let's talk about something that can genuinely transform your score on the Synthesis FRQ, and it's simpler than most students think. Understanding the rubric isn't cheating, and it isn't gaming the system. It's the same thing a contractor does when they read the blueprints before breaking ground. The College Board has handed you the exact specifications. Your job is to build to them. The architecture of the rubric, the Synthesis FRQ, is worth 6 points. And those points are divided into 3 distinct categories: 1 point for thesis, 4 points for evidence and commentary, and 1 point for sophistication. Think of it like a building. The thesis is your foundation. Without it, nothing else stands properly. Evidence and commentary is the structure itself, the walls and beams where most of your score lives. Sophistication is the architectural flourish on top, beautiful when it's there, but impossible to appreciate if the building hasn't been built correctly first. What many students miss is that these 3 categories are assessed somewhat independently. You can earn the thesis point and the evidence points even if your sophistication is weak. So when you're in the exam room feeling rushed, Prioritize in order. Nail your thesis first. Build your evidence and commentary as robustly as you can, and then reach for sophistication if you have the time and the tools. The thesis point, 1 point, non-negotiable. The thesis earns exactly 1 point, and the College Board is surprisingly specific about what earns it. Your thesis must make a defensible claim, meaning it takes a position that a reasonable person could argue against. If you write something like, "There are many perspectives on the use of social media," you have summarized a situation, not staked a claim. That gets you nothing. But if you write, "Although social media platforms claim to connect communities, their algorithmic design actively fragments public discourse and undermines democratic deliberation," now you have something the rubric can reward. The thesis must also respond to the prompt. Sounds obvious, right? But under pressure, students sometimes write beautiful, sophisticated claims that drift from the actual question. Stay anchored. The thesis can appear anywhere in the essay. Introduction, conclusion, middle, but it must be 1 or 2 sentences of focused argumentation, not a restatement of the prompt. The most common trap here is the 3-pronged thesis, which lists your 3 body paragraph topics. Listing your plan is not the same as making a claim. A defensible claim takes a stance on the issue, not a tour of your essay. Evidence and commentary where the real points live. This category runs from 0 to 4 points, and it rewards a progression of quality. The College Board describes a spectrum. At the lower end, you're simply mentioning sources or using evidence without explaining its relevance. At the higher end, you're integrating multiple sources into a coherent, well-reasoned argument with specific, relevant commentary that genuinely advances your thesis. Think of it this way. Imagine you're a detective presenting a case. A weak detective walks into the courtroom and says, "Here's a fingerprint, here's a footprint, here's a witness statement." That's evidence, but it proves nothing unless you explain how each piece connects to your conclusion. A great detective says this fingerprint found on the murder weapon belongs to the defendant, which establishes not just presence, but contact with the instrument of harm. That's evidence plus commentary, and that's what earns the upper end points. For the Synthesis FRQ specifically, you need to cite and use at least 3 of the provided sources to earn the higher scoring levels. College Board rubric language says you must incorporate evidence from at least 3 sources. Just quoting isn't enough. You need to explain how the evidence supports your line of reasoning. A common student mistake is piling in sources like garnish on a plate, decorative but not integrated. Instead, think of sources as witnesses you're calling to support your argument. Each one should say something specific that your commentary then unpacks and connects to your thesis. The 4-point evidence and commentary scale essentially asks, how well do you reason? Students scoring a 1 or 2 are reporting what sources say. Students scoring a 3 or 4 are using what sources say to build an argument. The difference is the presence of genuine analytical commentary, sentences that explain why the evidence matters, how it connects to other evidence, and what it proves about your central claim. Sophistication, the hardest point to earn. Let's be honest about sophistication. It's the point that trips up even strong writers, partly because it sounds vague. The College Board awards 1 point for demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of the rhetorical situation. What does that actually mean in practice? It means your essay does something more than make a basic argument. It might acknowledge and genuinely engage with a counterargument, not just dismiss it. It might explain the limitations of your own position. It might connect the local issue in the prompt to a broader context, historical, cultural, or disciplinary, in a way that adds real analytical depth rather than just name-dropping a concept. Here is the critical distinction. Sophistication is not complexity for its own sake. Writing long, winding sentences with big vocabulary does not earn this point. What earns it is intellectual maturity, the kind of thinking that says, yes, but it's more complicated than that. If your essay about social media regulation acknowledges that platforms face genuine First Amendment tensions that make simple solutions politically and legally fraught, and if you weave that tension into your argument rather than just mentioning it, you're thinking sophisticatedly. If you just say, some people disagree but I still think I'm right, you're not. The trap students fall into is saving their sophistication move for a single paragraph, usually the conclusion, where it reads like an afterthought. Sophistication that is tacked on rather than woven through will not earn the point. It needs to feel like a natural feature of your reasoning, not a last-minute addition. Connecting the rubric to your broader skills. Everything you've studied in this course feeds the synthesis rubric. Your work on rhetorical analysis taught you how to read sources critically, which directly improves your evidence and commentary. Your understanding of audience and purpose, covered in the earlier units on rhetorical situation, underlies the sophistication point, and your practice with argumentation from Unit 4 is the backbone of a strong thesis. The Synthesis FRQ is, in many ways, the culminating task of the course. You are reading rhetorically, arguing persuasively, and synthesizing multiple perspectives all at once. When you sit down on exam day, picture those three categories, thesis, evidence, and commentary, sophistication, as three separate checkboxes. Run through each one before you write, as you write, and before you finish. That intentional habit can be the difference between a 3 and a 5. Next, we'll shift from understanding how the essay is scored to actually practicing the writing process under timed conditions, so you can move from knowing the rubric to owning it. 5.18 Distinguishing between synthesis, rhetorical analysis, and argument FRQ tasks. Let's talk about the three big essays on your AP Lang exam, because confusing them is one of the most common and most costly mistakes students make on test day. Imagine you're a chef, and someone hands you a recipe card. If you can't tell whether you're supposed to be making soup, a sandwich, or a souffle, it doesn't matter how skilled you are, you're going to end up with something inedible. The synthesis, rhetorical analysis, and argument essays are three completely different dishes, and the College Board is absolutely looking to see whether you know which one you're cooking. What all three essays share, and why that makes them easy to confuse. Before we separate them, it's worth acknowledging why students mix them up in the first place. All three essays ask you to write analytically. All three reward sophisticated thinking, clear organization, and strong command of evidence. All three will score you on a 6-point rubric that evaluates your thesis, your evidence and commentary, and your sophistication of thought. That shared rubric structure can lull you into thinking these tasks are interchangeable. They are not. The scoring rubric may look similar across essays, but what earns points in each category is fundamentally different depending on which task you're performing. The synthesis essay, you are the curator. Think of the synthesis essay as your job as a museum curator. Someone gives you 6 or 7 sources, articles, charts, images, speeches, op-eds, and asks you to build an exhibit around a central question or issue. Your job isn't just to describe what's in each display case. Your job is to arrange those sources in a way that supports an argument of your own. You decide what the exhibit means. The College Board defines synthesis as the ability to draw connections between multiple sources and integrate them into a coherent, supported argument. That word integrate is doing enormous work here. Integration means the sources serve your argument. You are not summarizing them, you are not listing what each one says, and you're absolutely not letting them speak for yourself without your voice guiding the conversation. The exam requires you to cite at least 3 of the provided sources, but stronger essays use more, and they use them purposefully, not just as decoration, but as load-bearing evidence. Here's a trap students fall into constantly. They write what looks like a wonderful book report. They explain source A, then explain source B, then explain source C. That's not synthesis, that's summary with extra steps. Synthesis happens when your argument is the spine and the sources are the ribs branching off it, not when each source gets its own paragraph that stands alone. Your thesis must stake a specific claim on the issue, and every source you bring in should be filtered through your lens, your reasoning, your voice. The rhetorical analysis essay, you are the translator. Now imagine you're a film critic. Someone shows you a movie and asks you not whether the movie is good or bad, but how it works, how the director used lighting, dialogue, pacing, and camera angles to create a specific effect on the audience. That's rhetorical analysis. In this essay, you are given a single text, usually a speech, letter, or essay, and you're asked to analyze how the writer uses rhetorical choices to achieve a specific purpose with a specific audience. Notice that you are not being asked whether you agree with the author. You are not being asked to argue your own position on the topic. You are being asked to dissect someone else's craft. The College Board specifically wants you to identify a defensible thesis that explains the overall rhetorical purpose or effect, then analyze how specific rhetorical choices, things like diction, syntax, structure, appeals to ethos, pathos, and logos, tone, imagery, and figurative language, work together to achieve that purpose. The most common mistake here is writing a thesis that simply identifies the rhetorical devices the author uses without explaining the effect. Saying the author uses pathos and repetition is not analysis. It's a shopping list. Your thesis needs to connect those choices to their effect. The author's use of anaphora and second-person address creates an urgent, inclusive tone that demands the audience see themselves as personally responsible for change. That's a claim. That's something you can build an analysis around. Another boundary condition to watch carefully. The rhetorical analysis essay is not an argument essay. You are not defending a position on the topic the author is discussing. If the text is about climate change, your essay is about how the author argues about climate change, not about climate change itself. Students who slip into arguing the topic rather than analyzing the rhetoric will lose their analytical focus and, critically, their thesis points. The argument essay. You are the advocate. The argument essay is the one where you finally get to have an opinion. No sources are provided, just a prompt presenting a claim, question, or issue. Your job is to construct a well-reasoned, evidence-supported argument for your own position. Think of yourself as a lawyer making a closing argument. You have a claim, you have evidence from what you know, and you need to convince the jury. Because no sources are handed to you, the evidence is entirely your responsibility. You draw from your own reading, observation, experience, and knowledge. The College Board rewards evidence that is specific and relevant. A vague appeal to many people or history shows will not earn full commentary points. You need real examples, grounded reasoning, and enough specificity that your reader can evaluate your evidence rather than just take your word for it. The argument essay also rewards what the rubric calls sophistication, and this is where students can really distinguish themselves. Sophistication doesn't mean using fancy vocabulary. It means complicating your own argument, acknowledging counter-arguments, exploring tensions, recognizing that the issue isn't entirely black and white, and then still arriving at a nuanced, defensible position. Thinking about the argument essay in connection to Unit 3 and Unit 4, your work on claims, evidence, and reasoning, will serve you well here. Keeping them straight on test day. Here's a quick decision rule you can run in your head during the exam. If the prompt gives you multiple sources and asks you to write about an issue, you're synthesizing. If the prompt gives you a single text and asks you to analyze how it works, you're doing rhetorical analysis. If the prompt gives you a claim or question and no sources, you're arguing. Read the prompt twice before you write a single word and identify which chef's hat you're putting on. The biggest trap of all, and this shows up in every rubric guide, is blending the tasks. Don't analyze sources rhetorically in a synthesis essay as if you're doing rhetorical analysis. Don't argue your opinion in a rhetorical analysis. Don't summarize a provided passage as if you're synthesizing multiple sources when only one text is on the page. Stay in your lane, and your lane will take you a long way. As you move deeper into your exam preparation, understanding these distinctions will become the foundation for how you approach every timed writing prompt. And in the next section, we'll look at how to build a thesis that earns full points across all three of these tasks.